Hello, hello, cheeky natives. Welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. And I'm always with my girl. Hey, Dr. Slay.
Hey boo, how you doing?
I'm good. I've obviously been bothering you for us to talk to the author of this book.
Okay, the drama.
Today, we have the wonderful privilege of talking to a debut writer
Yeah.
who wrote A Soft Landing. And, I'm just going to, titillate you a little bit about what is happening. So, Wisani Mushwana was born in Andzani in the Limpopo province. He's currently a PhD candidate in English Literature Studies at the University of Cape Town. A Soft Landing is his debut novel, which formed part of his Masters of Arts degree in creative writing and was awarded with distinction. So we are obviously in the company of esteemed people who are graduating with distinctions. Hello, Wisani.
Hello. Hi, Faganolo. Hi, Alma.
Wisani, I really think that this book does a lot of things, right? I think for me, what I really kind of enjoyed about the book is not what is happening in the book, but what is happening beneath the book, right? So I wanted to know if these were the things that you were thinking about as you were writing, right? So the other current for me of kind of the book is like writing against this idea of homosexuality being an African, And the thing that I want to say in relation to this is this. There are a number of instances in the book, right? I think the kind of geographical location of the book set in rural Limpopo kind of paints a picture of like you would think that they would be outside of, let's call it, Western civilization. And because they're outside of Western civilization, let's say, the blemishes of Western civilization being homosexuality would not be infiltrated in a place like that. But I think another instance in which we see that is when Yolula goes to the grandmother, and the grandmother starts speaking about the trail of history of people who were queer, right? And so I wanted to know, like, kind of that undercurrent of the book. Was that something that you were hoping intentionally your readers would get? Or what was your idea around writing against the kind of often wildly held view about homosexuality being an African?
Yeah, I feel like I guess I was intentional with writing against this idea that homosexuality is an African, especially with the scene where Yolula and Andzani they go to the Eastern Cape to visit Yolula's grandmother. And Yolula tries to introduce Andzani, and he tries to tell her that they are a thing, they're in a relationship. And she tells him that she's not shocked. He's not unique, not in a bad way, but like she's encountered queer people before. And she started narrating the story to him about how one of her uncles was queer. Right. I think I was very much intentional with kind of creating that kind of a historical lineage of queer people having existed, from long, having been there, her being accustomed to queer individuals. I think that was important to me, especially her being in a village setting. So that was my main intention for doing that. Yeah.
And so I have a question around what appears to be essential themes, and that is the theme of abandonment, and I think that Tlhokomelo has just laid such a beautiful foundation, but there is a lot of abandoning that happens in this book. And I think what's particularly interesting is that Andzani is deeply flawed. So Andzani is in many ways experiences the parental abandonment from both parents in different ways, right? So I think often we think abandonment is just the physical lack of somebody's presence. But there is an abandonment that also takes place when the parent who is there is not able to be there fully. But then Andzani turns around and participates himself in an abandonment as it relates to his relationship. And so I want us to explore that concept both ways. So the abandonment is a recurring theme, but why Andzani then participates in something which has been such a painful part of his own life.
Yeah. Oh, that is a good one. That is a good one.
We
I
did
guess
say that we're going to bring some spice, Wisani. So
I know.
Take it away.
I was not prepared for that one. I think trauma, I think the only way I can try and explain his actions is trauma. I think what he knows is to run away from things. That is what he's learned from his parents, especially his father, who was there but never fully there, right? And so I guess inherited to a certain extent.
To think about kind of the way in which he comes back, right, is not kind of an acknowledgement of the trauma, right? Or acknowledgement of the harm that it did to Yolula. Because I feel like often people who do the abandoning, having been abandoned, knows the effect of it. But it feels to me like Andzani was just like, well, I'm back. I'm interested to problematize that a little bit, right? I do think that in as much as, we are supposed to love Andzani and, understand like the context in which we grew up, there are things that he does that are fucky, right? And he's not held accountable, or he doesn't
What an
even hold himself
understatement.
accountable. Well, yeah, he doesn't hold himself accountable. And I'm interested in that, right? Like, in what were you trying to kind of get to by, leaving a lot of things unresolved, right?
Yeah.
Particularly when it came to Andzani's kind of questionable behavior.
Yeah, I think my main thing with Andzani as a character was I do not want him to be likable, right? When I conceived of the character, I was like, yeah, I don't really want people to like him, right? I want people to understand him, to understand where he comes from, and to understand his actions, but I don't want them to like him. And so I guess that's why he's self-centered and he's selfish, and to a certain extent he thinks about himself, right? But also I think life did him dirty. I think life was never kind to him. Growing up, life was never kind. It was never kind to him, and so he feels like life owes him a lot. That's where he gets the "I don't care" attitude. The selfishness. I think that comes from having had a hard life.
There's a little bit further of exploration that I want us to do a little bit around the boundaries between trauma and the ways in which, of course, makes us ask of us to be gracious, but also the boundary, I suppose, between the grace that we extend to people because of their trauma, but also the accountability that people then have to almost be held to, right? And I think that there's a question that you yourself ask around trauma in the book, right? So Andzani's gone through a lot, but Andzani also puts people through a lot, and I think that there's a lot of trauma in the book, and I think it would be good to hear what some of your own resolutions have been in writing this book, right? So yes, Andzani's unlikable, Andzani's deeply flawed, but Andzani's also somebody who's experienced a lot of trauma, right? And like Tlhatlhogonolo says, then inflicted on other people. But what are some of your meditations around what it means to be somebody who experiences pain, but then also needs to be held accountable? Because I feel like that for me is like Tlhatlhogonolo is saying, is missing, but I guess missing in the book, but it would be good to hear your own reflections on what that looks like.
Oh my word. Oh my word. Okay. I personally,
this is a safe space, right?
I'm trying to, because now I have to insert
because
where I can.
I think what Alma and I are trying to get to is that, of course, writing the book, there are some things that you were trying to answer or question or problematize, right? And some of them may not be resolved in the book because it's a novel, but interested in like, what are some of your own resolutions around kind of Andzani's behavior and Andzani's kind of trauma and all of that? What are some of the things that you may have resolved from yourself? You could, be like, I don't care, but some of the things that you were thinking about.
Yeah, I guess this goes back to, what I had intended or what I was thinking about when I was writing the book, which I wanted to explore the theme of shame, mostly in the book, right? And so Andzani experiences a lot of shame because of who he is and from his community. And I think, no, that's a hard one. That's the hard one because I'm trying to not insert myself, but okay. So
I mean, we want you to insert yourself, right? So let's take Andzani out of the picture.
So we're interested. So that's the thing. We think that, so fiction is often the gray area where the author's personal opinions, not necessarily lived experiences, but the author's personal opinions, views, and their lived experiences and other people's lived experiences sort of form that book, whatever it may be. And also why I asked about your reflections, maybe also that at the end of writing this book, your reflections on particular things may change, right? And it's reflected in the characters' lived experience and the characters' experiences in the book. So we want you to insert yourself. I mean, of course, this is not to say that a soft
You are
landing is
Andzani.
about Wisani. Of course, we're not saying Andzani is you or whoever, but it is interesting to just hear your own opinions on things that happen in the book, right? Because we know that characters often take on a life of their own outside of what your imagination of what would happen may have been. So when you're encountering an Andzani who is just, like the Tokonolo says, a little bit fucky in some of the things that happen in the book, it's interesting to see what your own reflections of that fuckiness may be,
Okay. So I was saying about shame. I was really interested in exploring the kind. I guess Andzani's actions are informed by the shame that he was made to feel. Right. I think it reflects. I think his actions reflect what he feels internally as a result of the shame that he was made to feel. Right. And I think for him, I guess, to not be fucky, he has to kind of deal with that shame. I think it is at the core of who he is, at the core of how he perceives the world, how he expresses the world. And so the main thing, in order to not be a shitty person and kind of be likable, would have to, he'd have to deal with, he'd have to come to terms with himself and kind of deal with the shame that he was made to feel, the shame that kind of altered him and altered his worldview. Yeah.
So it's interesting that you say that, because I want to link it with, I think, kind of what the book tries to explore, right? Like you speak about this idea of shame and how this shame kind of filters through to many relationships that Andzani has, because in many ways he hasn't processed the shame and identified it as such, right? And so it's kind of projected onto other people. But in many ways, queer people seem to have kind of a delayed puberty, right? And that causes some form of grief because they haven't had the experience of a full childhood. And I'm not saying all queer people, but I think for most queer people, right? And I think the way in which this is typified in the book, particularly the scene between Neo and Andzani, right? And you think about like kind of the way in which they existed in each other, right? So possibly no one told them that them kissing or touching each other, whatever, was wrong. But the way in which that they acted, you could see that they knew that this would be frowned upon, right? So in many ways, unlike their heterosexual counterparts, they didn't have a full spectrum of their childhood, right? So for me, I think that shame also comes with the fact that like the mistakes Andzani makes now is the mistakes that many teenagers made when they were younger, but he's now making it as an adult, right? And so while not to excuse his behavior and his fuckiness, but it is to say that like I think one of the major themes is to speak about like a moment of thinking about queer grief, in a sense that for many queer people, we've not had the ability to live full lives. And so we carry that shame of the things we did in the dark, right, with us. And then it kind of filters through to the way we interact with people. And for some queer people, you think about Andzani, right? And you think about before Yolula and with Yolula in so many ways, that Andzani is still like, even though he may realize for himself that he's queer, outwardly, right, he's still kind of shameful. So the hookups are happening in secret type of thing, right? And the hookups don't create any kind of intimacy or connection. It's just bam, bam, thank you, grinder. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, right? Kind of the way that the non-fullness of a childhood experience impacted the way in which Andzani showed up into.
He was made to feel, he was an outcast, he was different. And so there comes a moment when he undergoes a metamorphosis, right? So all his life is being shamed and undergoes the metamorphosis, and that alters how he views the world, that alters how he is as a person, as an individual. Yes, and so I guess through that metamorphosis, when he has to act manly and present as a man and has to get rid of all those feminine features, there's suppression that takes place, right? And I think, in suppressing, the question is to what end, right? When is the limit, right? And he was not taught how to love, right? It wasn't until the moment he met Yolula, I don't think he really knew how to kind of love another man, right? Because that is something that
it's fascinating that you say that, because now I'm thinking, I'm like, but well, are we taught how to love? Like, I'm just kind of, I feel like I'm pondering on the fact, but I take your point, right? Your point is like, he had never been able to fully give himself to someone emotionally in that way, right? But I'm sitting here and I'm like, whoa, that's actually quite profound, right? Like, are we taught how to love? So do we show up in relationships in the way that like we were showed or not showed effectively?
Yeah, I think if he was exposed to other queer individuals who were in relationships, then I think he would have learned something from that, right? Being told not to do a particular thing and being shamed for it and being bullied for wanting to love another man, that I think that alters how you love. I think to a certain extent, that alters how you engage with other men, for example, right? And so when you have to get into a relationship, there's a lot that you kind of have to unlearn, and there's a lot that you have to learn. The violence that he inflicts on other people is a result of the kind of suppression, having had to suppress desires.
So I guess my question is also then around health, right? And we've spoken a lot about trauma, but we haven't really, I feel like delved into mental health, which is a theme that recurs quite a lot in the book. And I'm interested in two people particularly, with Andzani's mom and Andzani himself, right? Because there's a thing about the ways in which his mother navigates her own trauma that then of course affects not only her mental health but the people around him. And I think that there's the thing about writing about imperfect mothers particularly that is always interesting for me to see in print, right? Because there's a trope about the mom just almost being like perfect, right? We struggle with the idea that a mom may not be perfect or may be flawed and wounded and scarred. And so I want to talk about Andzani's mom and her mental health and what that then looks like in the context, and why you felt that it was important to write her story in the way that you did.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I think there's this notion that mothers always know when their sons are gay. And I'm like, why does it always fall on the mother, right? It's never fathers always know, right? It's always mothers always know, your mother knows. I'm like, I I don't know, right? So yeah, there's this expectation of mothers, being perfect. I think what I was trying to do with Violet was I was trying to think about grief. I've never experienced the grief that Violet or Andzani have experienced. And so I often wonder how grief will alter me. That's quite dark, but I feel like once death knocks, you change as a person and everything around you changes. I was trying to explore the idea of grief, but also this idea that it's linear, right? You lose something, not necessarily people, whatever, you lose something and you mourn that particular thing, and then you come out on the other end and you are healed, right? I was not convinced by that. I don't think that's how it works. And Violet became that character I was using it as a tool to kind of think through the idea of grief. Also with Andzani, I think my main thing with Andzani was because I used the thing, he's from Bamangisi and then he moves to Cape Town, right? He wants to live. He wants to experience freedom, right? The freedom that he did not experience while he was in Bamangisi. And so there's this running that takes place, like running away from your past traumas, right? In order to kind of come on the other end and you're a new person, you're a different person. And I guess with that, I was trying to say, he is a body that has experienced trauma and the trauma moves with him, right? Even though he's moving from one space to a different space, he cannot escape the trauma because it's a part of him. And so he cannot run away from it. And that affects him mentally. That speaks to the mental health theme.
I'm interested in the geographic positioning or the locality of these characters, right? So, because there's also a statement that I think you make about privilege, right? And also the space to be in particular locations. But it's interesting that you choose two very contrasting locations. So you choose Limpopo, and then you contrast that with the Western Cape. And I want to know why you chose the locations that you chose, but also what you were hoping to achieve in doing that.
They often say, write what you know. And I was like, okay, I've lived in Baba Menjisi all my life. And I've spent I've spent almost 8 years in Cape Town. I think I know Cape Town a bit. And so that was my main thing. But also, one thing, I could have said the novel in Cape Town and not do the Limpopo, but I just want to put my characters in a not so urban space and try and see how they experience the space, which, that's something that I don't often come across queer individuals experiencing the non-urban spaces. It's always urban spaces because I guess there's this belief that urban spaces offer freedom, for queer individuals, which is not true. But also that is something that I was trying to contrast, having Baba Menjisi and Cape Town as two contrasting spaces, but also wanted to show how similar they are, right? Because I guess my main thing was Andzani leaves Baba Menjisi for Cape Town because he's after freedom, but is he really free when he gets to the city space, right? Because this notion that Cape Town is a safe haven, right? And does it feel safe? Is it true? I guess I was trying to explore that, but also show that it really is a myth. There's this whole thing that Cape Town as a city is a safe haven for queer individuals, right? I'm saying put black bodies in the city space and see how safe the city space is and how welcoming it is. So I think that was my main, the main idea that I was trying to explore when I contrasted these two spaces.
Interestingly, I think there's a contrast that you do also in terms of the characters, right? So I'm thinking of Andzani and Yolula because there's also a very particular positioning that you do. So less about space and more, I guess, you use the space or the physical location almost as a proxy for class, right? For class, which is interesting, right? Because Yolula and Andzani are so completely different. It's just, we're introduced to somebody who sounds a particular way, who navigates their lived experience and navigates Cape Town, which I guess also then is almost a proxy for whiteness in a very particular way. And that I'm very curious about why you chose to have people who are so particularly contrasting in their relationship, right? In terms of the upbringing, where they come from, etc.
Yeah. I think Yolola's he's quite familiar with the politics of the city space. He's doing an English degree and he's done research on he's writing his PhD on this and focusing on the city of Cape Town specifically, right? And Andzani is someone who is quite ignorant, right? Well, he's not informed, I guess. Not ignorant. He's not really informed, right? He doesn't have the backing of research. I guess the contrast between the two characters, but also Yola went to a boarding school. He went to good schools and still is not quite welcome in the city space. And so class really doesn't matter, right? Even though he has certain privileges, right? He speaks a certain way and he's able to get into all these white spaces. He still experiences, violence. So I guess class doesn't set him apart, right? He still experiences the same violence in occupying the city space.
It's interesting that you say that because for me, I think in many ways, you spoke about the idea of wanting to create kind of this quest for freedom for Andzani, right, who leaves this place to go look for some kind of freedom, but does he really find it? But I think also it's not only freedom, it's like in many ways, Andzani and his mom are the same, right? In terms of how they're dealing with grief, right? We think about Andzani as like double badge grief, so to say, and Andzani's mom as kind of like grieving the death of her kid, right? And how for Andzani's mom, she has to stay in the grief, right? Because she can't leave her home. But Andzani, in many ways, kind of runs away from the grief. So physically aware that Neo is not there anymore, that younger sibling is not there anymore. But he believes that by moving to Cape Town in search of freedom, it's also moving away from the reality of having to deal with the kind of death and passing. And we see this as kind of like showing up in many ways, right? The dreams, the kind of photograph, the kind of angst that exists in a Cape Town that is not free, and not free because it's not queer friendly or all of that. But as we said earlier, a lot of what Andzani is dealing with is turmoil from within, right? And that turmoil is not going to change by change of location, particularly. And so I'm really interested in the way in which like that grief kind of manifests, right? Because I think it's also connected to, again, governmental structures, right? So you think about how the book speaks a lot about failure, and we'll speak about the kind of tragedy that happens in the book as a big governmental failure. But I'm thinking about the instances in which Andzani's mom is depressed, right? And she's dealing with grief, but she does not have access to healthcare, right? Because public healthcare is not easy to go by. And oh, for crying out loud, don't go to a state institution and say you are depressed. I mean, come on. Like, you're taking resources from people who actually have, as people with problems, right? Yeah, they're actually sick. And it feels that Andzani, in many respects, is able to buy himself some kind of freedom, one by leaving, but also he has the option that if he wanted to go to therapy, that he could have gone because he's got the economic ability to do so. And we see him kind of at the final bits, also, I suppose, being afraid to experience another form of grief in the sense of losing a parent, taking the mom to a hospital for her to be treated for her mental health, right? So it's just, it's kind of, you do something really interesting, right? On the one hand, class is not a protector, because no matter what Yolula does, he's still Yolula, he'll still experience the discrimination because class doesn't protect. But on the other hand, class allows some form of privilege. Because Andzani has moved up a class, he's able to provide for his mom in ways that he wouldn't have been able to if he didn't get the degree that he got, if he didn't go to Cape Town for all these kind of opportunities. So for me, it's interesting to think about like kind of class plays a non-protector, but also is a protector. It is a marker of not freedom, but also a marker of freedom. But also it reminds us that actually money is dignity. So you think about like what happens in the book, and we will speak about the tragedy of the book, but it is that in many ways people have dignity because they have money.
Of course, that is true. I think, money buys you freedom. To a certain extent, money buys you freedom. And with freedom comes, I guess, the will to live, right? And so Andzani experiences, I guess, momentary relief by moving from Manchester to Cape Town and kind of trying to run away from the grief and from the trauma and trying to start afresh. But that is a momentary solution. When the memories haunt him, then he has to face, he has to kind of face the music. And for Violet, she does not have the money, right? She does not have access to healthcare, right? She can't go to a mental institution because she cannot afford it. And so she has to stay, she has to experience, she has to face the music throughout, whereas Andzani, lives. I feel like if she had money, her grief would have been different. She would have had access to individuals who would be able to help her get through it. And so a lack of resources really affects how she deals with the grief.
And one of my favorite characters in the book is Andzani's uncle. Because I feel like Andzani's uncle is a co-conspirator, right? Co-conspirator in this sense. I have a slight suspicion that Andzani's uncle knew what was going on between Neo and Andzani, right? It was okay to give them the space to be who they are. But also a co-conspirator in a fact that like he really shows up for Andzani's mom where Andzani is not able to, again, because of distance or whatever. Yeah, he was really like a solid person, although I'd be mad at him because we know why I'd be mad at him, we know why I'd be mad at him.
Why would you be mad at him? He's a nice person.
Yeah, but like, would Neo have died though?
And I think that Neo is like an example of how the inequalities in this country are not victimless, right? So we often think that like inequality and the fact that there are still children who use pit toilets at school, that often feels like an abstract concept, almost if you're living a very particular life. But what we're seeing is that inequality in many ways in this book just you can't be shielded from it, right? So like corruption, worsening inequality is not a victimless crime, you know. So I think that he would have, because the way that this country is set up, right, when you are somebody like Neo, in one way or another, a governmental failure or inequality is going to set you back, right?
Yeah.
Or is going to result in some sort of harm for you, be it in the lack of adequate public transport, which means that you have to take car X or route X that is not in the condition that it should be, which means that you get involved in a road accident that then impairs your ability to function. You know, things like that. Like the fact that in our areas there are no pedestrian bridges, there's no safe places for people to cross, or like what happens to now, right? Where people have not been given access to electricity, and so they have to do what they have to do in order to access it, right? So it's like the lengths at which people will go to access what should be basic amenities means that
Yeah.
something like this was going to, something would have happened to Neo because of
Yeah.
how precarious his life is. Wisani does a great job of showing that like how many Neos exist, how many people in this country have their lives radically altered because they
Yeah.
find themselves on the wrong side of the tracks.
That is exactly what I was trying to do. I was trying to show how the past affects the present, right? Especially South African's history, how it affects ordinary citizens, right? And through what an individual would consider a small thing, electricity, right? Had the government delivered, basic services to the community of Mbamejisi, had they installed electricity, none of, Neo would definitely have he would have had a different trajectory, right? I think Andzani and Neo would have lived a different life, right? But because the lack of basic services and how the past is infiltrating the present and affecting ordinary citizens in different ways. And so yes, the electricity aspect of it, and of course the pit toilets, those are remnants of apartheid, and they still show the significant role that apartheid still plays in the current moment. Yeah.
But yeah, Neo, did it have to be Neo? Like, I'm asking really, did it have to be Neo?
Yes. I started with Andzani, and because he's the main character, but not necessarily. I started with Neo. It was actually a short story, and I remember I was telling a friend of mine that because I kept seeing Neo lying on the ground with cables covering him, right? I kept seeing that image, and I was like, I told a friend of mine, I keep seeing this image. I think I want to do something about it. The only way I can get rid of such, haunting images is through writing. It was a short story with Neo, and he was always gonna die, right? And so when I got to do my master's in creative writing, I was like, because the short story was not working out, so I had to have a larger,
Body of
I was like, this works, instead of it being a short story with him just dying after a couple of pages, let me give him some background story. Then let me give him a life.
For me, I think that's one of the most tragic things in the book is like witnessing that, because it does happen, like it's not that it doesn't happen, it really actually does happen. So, I mean, I suppose the other question then is, why a soft landing, right?
Yeah.
The book does a lot. We've spoken about abandonment, we've spoken about mental health, we've spoken about kind of governmental inequities, corruption not being a victimless crime. But when I pick up the book and it says a soft landing, make it to make sense, my dear. Please make it make sense.
We all want to land softly. The title speaks to my character's need to find respite from their individual life struggles, right? All of them go through some form of grief. They either through the loss of people they love, or through, I guess, with Andzani having to move from Bamejisi to Cape Town, he grieves for the space, and I guess what could have been if Neo didn't die, and things like that, right? And so, Violet Auskitsi also grieves for Neo, Andzani also grieves for Neo, Violet grieves for her child, and so they experience different forms of grief. And so I guess, yeah, it speaks to their need to find respite and to land softly, but also hope. I think Andzani lands softly, toward there's hope that there's a softer landing, and Yolula is kind of there to facilitate this softer landing. So yeah. I think that's where I was trying to get to with the title.
I kind of love that, right? Just the idea of like we all each need a soft landing. Wow, like, okay, I accept.
we do. Life is hard.
That's
Life's too much.
soft.
Yeah, but
What's
that's
that
soft
song?
part.
Someone play Lumfundo More Soft Life. I guess my question's around the ending. I have so many feelings about this ending, Wisani. And we're just gonna have to go into it because I'm just like, what's going on? I
Yeah.
feel that the ending in some ways was like unresolved, and maybe that is the purpose of an ending. But like, we see Andzani doing the most for the least. And it's almost like, this carefully crafted life and exterior that he's created for himself in many ways comes crumbling, right? And I guess it's to pay homage to the idea that the body keeps score, so that as it relates to trauma and the like, the body keeps score. But Yolula then comes into the picture and is allowed into his confidence very late and very suddenly in the book. And I think I have questions around why that happens in the way that it does, because this is not a book of resolution, but there's almost a resolution that takes place towards the end. I'm curious about.
Alma, this is not a book of resolution. Yes, Queen, yes.
Listen. Okay, I must use my cheeky native English.
Listen.
But I'm really curious about that, and I'm struck by it. So I want us to talk a little bit about the ending and why things come together in the way that they do. I mean, there are a million ways in which you could have written this ending, but you chose this very particular one, and I'm curious about why.
Specifically, the like the end and the decision that
So
That very
Andzani taking Yolula into his confidence.
That very end.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because Andzani's been so deeply guarded, and we watch Andzani almost self-sabotage throughout this relationship. And there are decisions that both characters make that I find very interesting and very pointed. So Yandani, Yolula also then chooses to understand this behavior, which I find interesting thinking about Yolula's character throughout the book. Because Yolula has just been like, it's okay, my brother. Huh? You can keep it.
Come back.
You can keep what you are selling, you can keep. But in this particular instance, it's just like, wait, man, unjalo, yeah, can't. And I'm struggling to reconcile those two things as they come to the ending.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I actually hate that Yolula is nice to Andzani at the end. He's like, yeah, I understand, and I'm willing to go through this next phase with you. Going through therapy and dealing with whatever
Exactly,
issues.
like, understand that. Like, what is there to understand?
I think he also, if he's lonely, right? He loses his grandmother, right? And there's this, before he loses the grandmother, there's this imminent loneliness that's there, it's hanging over him. And so the moment she passes away, he becomes a lonely person. And I guess Andzani he loves Andzani, right? And he likes his company. And in trying to get away from his own loneliness, he wants to build something with him. And it's his character, he's compassionate and he understands, even though he had to go through all of.
Can you please read like 248 from the beginning until the end of 249? Just kind of, also a titillation for our people, but just to really express what we're talking about when we're talking about.
You want Alma to hate me more because she's like, why that ending? And now
I mean, I'm just interested in the complexities of the character,
Of course.
Also, even the people we love do things that make us ask ourselves why. Why did you take him back?
Yeah. Let me I guess let me just read to just contextualize people. I feel like I have to go update him about my life, my relationship, and ask for forgiveness for having deserted him. Andzani steadied his gaze before he continued. I want you to come with me. Yolula turned to face him. There was a brief moment when silence announced itself, but Andzani didn't allow it to settle. I want to introduce you to him. Let him know I have found love again and how happy I am when I'm with you. I just need you to be there. I promise we are not slaughtering animals and anything of that sort. We are just going to talk to him. I am going to talk to him. And therapy, Yolula asked. I haven't dealt properly with many things from my past. I think it's time. Yolula nodded. I just don't understand why you didn't come to me when you got back. I was worried about you. You don't ghost people you claim to love, Andzani.
Come on, preach, preach.
I was not in the right headspace. I did not know what was going on, and part of me didn't want you to look at me and see a burden. What does that even mean? We were in a relationship. This is just the basics of relationships. We share stuff, we solve problems together, and came back and settled on the couch. It hit Andzani then that Yolula had referred to their relationship in the past tense. He wondered what it meant if truly Yolula saw their relationship with the past eye. When I tell you to use your words, I mean in times like this, I want you to communicate with me. That's the only way I will know what is occupying your mind. Yolula stopped to think. Remember what you said about love. Andzani's eyes softened. That to love is to accept vulnerability, that you become so susceptible to hurt, to accept the possibility of loss, a certain preparedness for it, for the pain that comes with loving. Andzani remembered his words. This was what he had said to Yolula before he told him he loved him, and because of that, was prepared for everything that came with loving. To not love is to occupy a precarious position. At least love provides bearing, something you can always lean on. Precarity is a lonely road, Andzani. I don't want to remain on this road. It hurts worse, just existing in the city, knowing you do not want to see me. It hurts. Andzani got hold of Yolula's hand, and in that handshake-like gesture they preferred, he brushed his thumb. I buried my grandmother in your absence, Yolula added. How are you? Andzani asked. He didn't know what to say, and he wondered then if he had become comfortable with loss, if ever there came a point in one's life when loss didn't affect you. He wondered if he was nearing such a point, if he had become desensitized to news of death. Grief is weird, Yolula said. I've spent a long time alone after her death, negotiating myself around it, how to best respond to it. Is there even a best way to respond to grief? The emotions have been overwhelming. I'm grateful for life, but I do not want to spend the rest of my life alone. I'm sorry, Muranziwa, Andzani said. Yolula's eyes glistened. He liked it when Andzani called him Muranziwa. When do you start with therapy? Today. I'm actually on my way there. Can I come with? Yolula. Please let me. Andzani slanted his head to the side, and after a moment, nodded. So do you understand, Dr. Alman, why Yolula was quite comfortable, letting Andzani back into his life? The lonely road ahead. he was, I guess, scared of it.
It's deep, right? Where he says, I don't want to remain on this. Precarity is a lonely road, Andzani. I don't want to remain on this road. It hurts worse. Just existing in this city, knowing you don't want to see me. Oh, man. Okay. My dear.
I'm Jolo, guys. I'm Jolo.
Jolo is not for everyone.
Jolo will make you poetic.
I suppose, thank you so much for opening yourself and writing this book and having this conversation with us. What do you hope a soft landing do? Now that it's out in the world for some time, what do you hope? It's out of your hands now, right? What do you hope it would do or it does in the world?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting one. I think going back to my initial, why I kind of conceptualized the soft landing, kind of thinking through ideas of shame, the kind of shame that queer people are often made to feel for being queer, right? But also how that shame organizes queer lives, right? How it organizes queer relationships and queer kinship, right? How much of it affects, queer intimacy, I guess, to an extent, right? There's this belief that queer relationships do not last, right? There's like, that's another relationship that's gonna come to an end very soon. and I'm interested, it's a stereotype, right? But the thing about stereotypes is that it is not that they are untrue, but that they're incomplete, right? And so my thing was how much of the queer relationships do not last is a result of the shame that queer individuals are made to feel about themselves and how they navigate and negotiate, how they navigate, I guess, spaces and relationships and kinship, right? And so I think I was trying to think through that. And so I wanted to start a conversation, I want queer individuals to kind of think about how stigmatized shame affects them, right? I guess the relationship that they make and how they form relationships. I think that was the core thing. But also it's a soft landing, there's hope. Life doesn't have to be a dread. There's light at the end of the tunnel.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that because, having this frame or the discussion with you, the ending feels a little bit differently, right? I'm still angry, but I'm less angry because it feels hopeful, right? It feels in that Andzani, for his relationship and for himself and wanting to show up for himself, is taking the steps to go to therapy. And that's hopeful, right? So in many ways, it's like, let's use the resources that we have in order to ensure that we enter relationships better. And so, like, having had this conversation, I'm like, okay, I see kind of the whole thing, right?
Alma, do you also
I don't want to be victimized for my beliefs, Danny, so I'm just going to keep it moving.
Okay.
Because I just have deep feelings. No, I'm joking. I understand. I think that, there's a temptation to think about relationships and the ways in which people navigate love and romance and intimacy in very black and white ways. But underpinning that is a very real human need for companionship, for love, for the ways in which I think that a romantic partner fills up a very particular need in your life that I think people often, that you can't self-love your way out of, right? So you can't self-love, and I think I can understand why Yolula feels the way that he does about his partnership with Andzani, about his relationship with Andzani. But of course, in the duality of life, I can also simultaneously just be like, you know what? Andzani is deeply problematic and deeply flawed, but also requires that you extend yourself in ways that I don't know if Andzani would be willing to do for anybody else.
Yeah,
that which he demands of Yolula, I'm not sure that he would be able to extend himself to do.
That is true, actually. Given his track record, given his history, I highly doubt. But that's the thing about relationships. People say it's 50-50. It's never 50-50. I'm not justifying his actions. I'm not justifying him being a shitty person, but
That's okay. That's all right.
It's sad that Yolula has to be the stepping stone for Andzani, for Andzani to become this a better person. Life is unfair. I'm joking. Yeah.
But I think, it does allow us to think about the ways in which shame can rob us of many experiences and how we can unshackle ourselves of that shame. But also it does say that Andzani doesn't seem like the type of person, and maybe Andzani is doing this for Yolula, but if this was another person, things may have ended differently. So in many ways, it is that. It's kind of the fluidity of life, right? But thank you so much for writing the book, firstly, but also for taking some time to speak to us at the Cheeky Natives. I suppose a kind of practical question, so to say, do you think that the book would have been richer if you, after your master's dissertation, was like, okay, let me not for a master's thing, but for a novel, for a piece of literature, let me beat it into what I want it to be. Because I remember in conversations we've had when we launched the book, you basically said the book had to end because the master's was ending. But I'm wondering if it was different, would we have seen a deep kind of combing through of the book if you had more time to spend on it?
Yeah, of course, definitely. Yeah, I think we would have a total different thing. I guess also to a certain extent, I was thinking about the advice I got from someone close to me, and they were like, sometimes you have to let it go. You need to put it out out into the world. Just let it go. I think to a certain extent, I was thinking of that. But of course, if I had more time, if I'd had more time with it, I would have we would have a total different thing. And that's also scary, you know, having more time with it, because then you kind of alter it, and you know, in altering it, I guess, what would I have lost, you know, what would I have gained? But yeah, totally different thing, I guess. You know, with time it would have been richer and maybe not perfect, but yeah, I think it would be a different.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Wisani. We at the Cheeky Natives really appreciate it. Cheeky merchants, please, Cheeky Natives, get yourself a copy of the Soft Landing. No PDF. Don't ask the author to DM. Plus, you know, support Black writers.
DM us
So
for a copy
DM
of the
us,
book.
get a
And
copy.
we'll sell it to you.
Exactly. So thank you so much. And we hope that you will interact with us, like, share, comment, and just engage with the book. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you to you guys. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's always nice talking to you guys.